Dear participants, how are you all doing? I think we have come to the final day of the CRiT Summer School organized by the Taylor's University, Malaysia. So I think since Friday, probably people are slowly joining up because of some prayers. Because the last 4 days we had at least 300 over people at the beginning. I think people are slowly joining up. I think we are also getting some personal messages. We will be joining in a short while after the prayers. Okay, without further ado, once again I welcome you all to the CRiT Summer School, Day 5, Session 10. We have two exciting and eminent speakers joining us from Australia virtually, which will be on a very interesting topic, tourism and social justice. To moderate this session, we have two great academicians from our side, Dr. Mayuk Dewan and Ms. Sumita. As a practice of our last every day, we start with the housekeeping rules. So a soft reminder to everybody, we kindly request you to open your cameras during the digital photo session, which will be happening at the end of the session with a good hospitality smile. The mic will be muted all the time for the participants so that the speakers sharing will go very smoothly. Please post your questions only in the Slido, where we will share the code in the next slide, and also our team will post in the chat. We are using the same link from the beginning of the day. Please don't post any questions in the Zoom chat. Instead of that, you can use the Slido because it will not be entertained. Use the Zoom for any probably connections or probably networking and probably some other, if you have any technical issues to address there. And this is very important. Please use your full name by renaming yourself, because we have given the authorization to all the participants to rename, because that name will be taken for capturing attendance as well as for certificate for this respective session. We also would like to say that the certificates will be issued through email to all the participants within 7 days after we close today's summer school. A poll will be released in the Zoom after at the beginning of the interactive Q&A. Please complete the poll within 5 minutes. So this is the QR code. Time to take your phones, smartphones, scan the QR code to gear up yourself to post your questions. In case if you are not really keen or probably not looking to post the questions in the Slido, but there is also other option, you can like the others questions so that we can take more liked questions to post to the speaker by our moderator, Dr. Mayuk. Okay, without further ado, kindly allow me to introduce the moderator for today's session, which is session number 10, Tourism and Social Justice, which we have a very well-known academician in the School of Hospitality, Tourism and Events in Taylor's University, Dr. Mayuk Dewan, who's also a program leader, right? And also is also having a very good experience from overseas. He worked in UK for a while with an industry background, and also I think in the academic he already having close to 15 years of experience, and he also holds the position as a stream leader for the F&B department with the School of Hospitality, Tourism and Events. So without further ado, I would like to pass this virtual screen to Dr. Mayuk.
Thank you, Dr. Kandapan. Good afternoon, everybody. Am I audible to everybody? Can you give me a thumbs up? If all of you can hear me, fantastic. All right. So without taking much time, we've got fantastic speakers today. So I'll jump into the topic for today. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goal number 16 is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And in a gist, this goal says that we cannot hope for sustainable development without peace, stability, human rights, and effective governance based on the rule of law. Yet our world is increasingly divided. Some regions enjoy peace, prosperity, security, while the others are stuck with an endless cycle of conflict and violence. This is not inevitable, and it can and must be addressed. Armed violence and insecurity have been a destructive impact on the country's development, on many countries' development, affecting economic growth and often resulting in grievances for many generations. Sexual violence, crime, exploitation, and torture are also prevalent while wherever there is conflict or wherever there's no rule of law. And countries must take measures to protect people who are most at risk. So the Sustainable Development Goals aim is to significantly reduce all forms of violence and work with governments and communities to end conflict and insecurity. Promoting the rule of law and human rights are key to this process and is reducing the flow of illicit arms and strengthening the participation of developing countries in the institutions of global governance. Sorry. Our first speaker today to talk about this topic, I have Dr. Raymond Rastegar, who is from University of Queensland, Australia. Dr. Raymond joined the University of Queensland in 2010 after working on several projects on tourism development and environmental conservation in national parks. He holds a PhD in tourism management and is a lecturer and researcher in the Business School of University of Queensland. His research focus is on sustainable tourism development in developing countries with specific interest in sustainable livelihoods, participation, empowerment, and environmental conservation. Recent research projects have investigated the impacts of tourism at local level and delivered new insights into the tourism phenomenon to advocate a more just and sustainable tourism future. So in his talk, he will be highlighting some social justice issues in developing countries. And he'll be using national parks and UNESCO World Heritage Sites as examples. He'll talk about recognition, participation, and knowledge sharing. Finally, he'll also be presenting ideas on the COVID-19 pandemic and using this opportunity for justice turn in tourism research and practice. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Raymond. Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you so much. Just allow me please to share my screen. Thank you. I just want to use this opportunity firstly to say hello to everyone, wherever you are in the world. Before we start, I was looking at this chat box and I could see, people joining from different parts of the world. And that's so exciting to have this opportunity, just to see all these people and actually, talk to them. So I have to thank you, Dr. Mayuk, and everyone, all the colleagues, at Taylor's University, and I apologize if I'm not naming everyone. You have done such a fantastic job because I had the opportunity to participate and attend some of these sessions in the last few days, and I really enjoyed it. It was very informative, discussion talks, and it's really good to see, people speaking about a very important topic, sustainable development goals from, different perspectives. So today, when I was thinking about, our session, because it's about tourism and justice or social justice, I thought probably it's very obvious I have to focus, or our discussion has to focus on goal 16, because it's about promoting peace and justice. But then when I'm thinking about the conversation and all this discussion we had, especially in the last few days, I could see how different speakers talk about, how we have failed to achieve sustainable development goals. And it doesn't matter what they were talking about, I could always see this link to the justice issues. So I want to do something different today. I want to bring examples from different sustainable development goals and pose questions. I may not be able to answer all those questions today, but it's always good to start this thinking process to see why this is happening, why we are failing, and why we haven't achieved what we're supposed to. So let me start with the first example, goal 7. It says ensuring access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. Even when I'm thinking about all these, words next to each other, I think it can be probably very challenging, achieving all these, and, having all this in one goal. Because when you are thinking about, energy, it's always about, this debate of, economic growth. Governments are encouraging private sector, to invest and then create job, make money, and, probably produce energy. But even thinking about, sustainable and modern energy, it's speaking about this transition in energy. It's speaking about, moving away from fossil fuel and then probably having more of these renewable energy sources. But what does it mean actually? Because I can give you an example. For example, here even in Australia, when we are thinking about closure of this, power station, coal-fired power station, then it's estimated, for example, if you are closing this power station in 2023, then the energy price will go up by 30% in the following 2 years. So what does that mean for people? So when we are thinking about affordable and then modern energy, then it may not happen at least in this transition period. When we are thinking about affordable or reliable energy for all, does it mean building more dams, flooding more indigenous lands, flooding more farms, houses, forcing people to relocate? So what does that mean? Or, because it's very hard, just to think about all these, and achieving all these and not thinking about all these injustice issues. Even now, here in Australia, sorry, as part of, this, uh, recovery plan for COVID, government seems to be encouraging more exploitation of gas and coal sources, as part of their economic recovery plans. So it all can, create all these problems. Second goal I want to look at is climate change and its impacts. Probably all of us, we either have heard, experience, or, we all have been engaged and, felt this, impacts. It doesn't matter where we are living. Because when we are thinking about, climate change, it's not only about those small islands, seeing this sea level rises. It's about, flooding in Germany. It's about, coral bleaching in Australia. It's happening everywhere. And the thing is, when we are thinking about who is mostly affected by this, they are the people who are actually not responsible for this. Think about developing countries. There are many of these, indigenous community. There are many of these, marginalized group who are not even able to afford, buying a, airplane ticket. So they may not have much share in this, what's happening now, but they are still being affected, by many of these impacts. So we have many of these frameworks, we have many of these, ideas, discussing about, for example, adaptation. We are thinking about mitigation, which are wonderful, which are really good. But when we are thinking about, for example, adaptation, okay, we have to ask this question, who is able to adapt? If we are thinking about this, for example, people who belong to these lower socioeconomic classes. So these people are, even, turning on this, kettle for a cup of tea can be a source of stress for these people. So we can't, they can't imagine, having this aircon on for the whole day. When we are thinking about installing modification for buildings, many of these people can't afford it. They are, living in these rental properties. Okay, so it's probably for me wealthier people who can afford to move to probably more protected area, better houses, and then pushing away this, marginalized group or people who are, belonging to this lower, socioeconomic classes. And it's not only for developing countries; it's even happening here in Australia. We have those people even, here in developed world. So that's why, again, we need to think about this concept of, justice and climate justice and see what's happening here, asking this question. And the next goal I want to, it's actually very interesting because, recently we hear a lot about this term blue growth or blue economy. And I really like this term because we are very smart using this term blue and green whenever we want to speak about something sustainable. And if you go and search, probably you will see many of these documents and reports, even by governments. They are speaking about this, sustainable development of, using, marine resources, to bring, income to community. We are thinking about sustainable tourism in these areas, many different benefits, even sustainable fishery. But there are many, when we closely look at this, development, we see many of these society organizations and even people in academia, they are sounding this alarm, the way we are rapidly using and developing, these resources, it can create many justice issues. There are many of, whenever we have these, resources, there are many of energy, biotechnology companies, commercial fishing, deep sea mining, they are all attracted to these areas. I have an example, probably I should not name the region, but there is like a government, they are signing this agreement with a multinational company, for commercial fishing. So what's happening when they are moving in, these big, companies, and they can probably argue that it provides, benefit to the region, but what we are observing that these, local fishermen, they have to go deeper and deeper into the, sea to be able to catch fish. And probably after some times they can, continue, they can compete against these companies and they have to give up, something that they have been doing for, many generations. So here we have to ask these questions: who is benefiting? Who is facing the cost? Okay, even when we are speaking about this, green economy or blue economy, and that's the reason probably we have to introduce this, term of blue justice to be able to identify, these right holders who are, mostly affected in these developments. And the last example I want to use is about, these threats or biodiversity loss or biodiversity collapse that we had this conversation even in previous days. So I do not want to repeat everything, but we can see the link and the reason why this is happening to everything that we discussed so far. It can be about climate changes, it can be about unsustainable use of resources, it can be about negative environmental impacts. So there are now people who are, advocating and asking probably this question: what is a more than human world? How we can think about, other species? It's not always about human. How we can, think about, other species that have been living, on planet for many years. That's why, again, we have the term of ecological justice here, which is thinking about, rights for these all species without, regardless of the benefits or relationship they have to human. But the thing is, you see, whenever we are thinking or speaking or, having these development programs, we always have these injustice issues. We always need to introduce the term. It might be blue justice, social justice, environmental justice, ecological justice, because we need to deal with all these negative, impacts. So that's the time to ask question, why this is happening. And what is interesting here is that even these ideas can create conflicts, because now we have different groups who are, probably supporting different ideas. And that's interesting. If I want to give you an example, even when we are thinking about this idea of environmental justice, even though it uses the term environment, if you go and closely look at many of these cases, when you are looking at the application of the environmental justice, it's actually looking at the impacts on human and not the environment. Okay, and many of these social, scientists who are engaged in environmental justice, they are actually criticizing this, movement or the people they call tree huggers, because they say this they are probably they want to they do not consider the social justice, or they are forcing many of these people to move away from their lands, or they are not thinking about the how these communities are affected by negative impacts. Then on the other side, we have people who are advocating, and that's like an increasing interest for human rights. And we see some of these very radical approaches who are, proposing that we need half or 50% of each region in the world, okay, to be allocated for biodiversity conservation. So imagine what's happening if we start building these, walls. What's the implication for tourism? Okay, especially now because you heard in the last few days that environment or nature-based tourism is becoming even more important during this pandemic. Okay, so what's the application if we want to go ahead with this, ideas? And it brings us to this idea, it seems that building wall or barrier is the solution to every problem that we have now. If you go back to in history, if you think about 1,000 years ago, you see many of these people, they had to build these walls to protect themselves because they didn't know what's on the other side. They didn't know what's the threat. They didn't know how to have this dialogue and have this negotiation. But it's interesting, after thousands of years, okay, after all this civilization, we haven't managed to find a better solution. We are still thinking about building these walls. Just go and look at this list of these border walls. They are increasing. They are becoming very popular, and most of these walls were built after year 2000. So it's time for us to ask these questions. What's happening to our society? Excuse me. What's happening to our society, where we are heading, with all these ideas? We haven't managed to find a better solution. Saying that there have been some attempts, especially when we are thinking about these, conflicting ideas between, the right for human and non-human. So they started, people started, speaking about this idea of compassionate, for example, conservation, which tries to open these dialogues and to give compassion, consider compassion for non-human. However, again, some social scientists criticize the idea and say compassion should come for human first and then for non-human. And then we have this idea of just conservation, which tries to integrate justice, social and ecological justice. But again, this proposal calls for, restricting human activity, but then again, it argues that social justice has to come before, ecological justice. And we can't sacrifice social justice at the cost of, protecting, natural environment or, other species. So again, you will see this conflicting idea still happening. So it's probably the time for us to start, having this broader societal acceptance or agreement that we are part of mixed moral community, or ideas that are recently introduced as multi-species, justice. We do not need to advocate for one, or it just reminds me of the idea that Michael discussed on the first day. Maybe the way we are defining sustainable development is wrong. We do not need to sacrifice one to achieve the other one. Okay, we have to learn to see how we can, have this probably coexist and how we can peacefully live together. It doesn't matter it's human, it's non-human, or it's natural environment. And just summarizing the discussion we had, when we are thinking about any of the idea that we discussed so far, it doesn't matter if it's ecological justice, it's social justice, it's energy justice, blue justice, they are all linked. Because even, for example, when we are thinking about the idea of climate change and its impact, when we are introducing the idea of climate justice, it's not only about human, it's about other species. So there is a strong link between all these ideas. Okay, so whenever anything happens, even when you are thinking about this biodiversity loss or collapse, it's going to affect human. Okay, so it doesn't matter what the problem is or what goal we are looking or we are trying to achieve, what sustainable development goal. We always need to consider all these ideas and see how we can probably have a better society that we can all peacefully live together. So it was just about having this bigger picture to see what's happening. But now I want to give you a couple of examples to see how these ideas, conflicting ideas, even at much smaller scale in tourism development in probably very small regions, can create conflicts. Okay, And the reason I use the term role of government here is because I want to use the examples from developing countries. And we know in many of developing countries, tourism is not actually a private sector, it's part of the government, or it's a government body. Here we have the strong influence or voice of the government to make decision and implement the plan, which can create many problems. We have this, issue of the people who are not involved in decision making, who are not informed, and then many of these, problems that may happen, especially because tourism recently has been used as a tool for development in many of these regions. So the first case I want to discuss is a case of World Heritage and social justice. We all know how exciting it is when you hear about the site being inscribed as a World Heritage Site. For example, I heard in the last 2 weeks we had this different site, I think Guangzhou in China, then we had Kakatiya temple, if I'm not wrong, in India, then we had this railway in Iran, and then another site in Spain. So if we have people from these regions, congratulations, that's wonderful. You must feel very proud, of this inscription, because it's bring recognition, it's probably preserve natural cultural heritage. It can bring, development, tourism, and probably many, positive benefits for many years to come. So it all looks good. Even if you are looking at different studies and literature, we are highlighting all these positive impacts. But to have a better understanding of this process, I and two of other colleagues, we selected a destination in central Iran, the heritage city of Yazd, to see actually what is happening in this process when a city or a monument is being inscribed as a World Heritage Site. So we decided to go and speak to local people as the key stakeholder, because we wanted to hear their voice. So we interviewed these people 2 years after inscription, and we also observed this, dialogue and communication and conversation on different social media platforms to see how they are feeling about the impacts. Definitely, we could see some positive impacts like, job creation for some people, community pride, preservation of the heritage, the money government was spending, just to conserve this, resources. But then we could see many other, justice issues. And you do not usually see this problem until you go and speak to these people, to these local people, because from outside it looks all good. When you are looking at these videos and these promotions, everything, it's all beautiful. But when you go and speak to these people, you see and hear about the problems they have, about the conflicts. It's probably out of our time. I cannot explain everything, but I will try to highlight a few issues that we identified in our study. For example, the center of this city is a heritage part of the city, and there are many old buildings and very narrow streets. So it used to be the place which probably cost of living was less. This was for a place for people who belonged to lower socioeconomic classes, or people who moved from other cities to work, in this particular city. And after inscription, these people, local people of the city, they were not happy to see these people living in that area, because they believe they are not true representatives of local culture, because they thought there are many tourists coming to this city and we do not want them to see these people and the way they are living. Okay, so it started creating this conflict in this region. However, the area was getting too expensive and it was very difficult for these people to live, and they had to move out and go and live, in other areas, because they couldn't afford, to live in this region anymore. The other problem we identified was that because these people were not involved in decision making in the process of inscription, because we interviewed people, and actually none of these people were involved in the process, and they have not been informed about any of this decision. They said we could either, hear something in the news or, see something happening. So they were not happy about this process of renovating of the buildings leading to the inscription, because they thought the buildings are looking very good now, nice, but the material used, it's not representation of, it's not showing our culture, it's not showing our tradition. So they were not happy with with the way these buildings were renovated. And then we also had people who said we can see tourists coming in, we can see traffic, we can see many other impacts, but we cannot actually see the benefit from tourism. So there are many other problems, that probably we could identify in this, in this area. And when we are thinking about the whole process, the main reason we identified here, because these decisions were made by the central government, and then they go ahead and implemented the plan without informing and involving people in decision making. So these people had no role in this process. They have no say about because they actually feel they had this feeling of ownership about this heritage, because it was part of their identity. So they wanted to be involved. They wanted to have their say, to say, for example, how to conserve it, how to probably renovate this, or how to even develop tourism in this region. So if you're interested, I really encourage you to go and read this paper, which is published in Journal of Sustainable Tourism. The second example I want to use here is a case of tourism in protected areas. And that's interesting. This is probably the reason I moved to tourism, because I have environmental science background. I do not have tourism background. And the reason I moved to tourism, to study tourism and do my PhD, was because there was this idea that tourism can probably brings benefit and solve many problems in the natural, in these protected areas, in national parks. We can develop tourism, we can create jobs, we can, bring ecotourism, for example, to the region. Community can benefit, and then we can use the money to conserve the environment. So you can see many of these, many of these ideas. But actually, it was interesting for me, for myself, and my experience later, to realize that tourism itself can be a problem. Okay, it may not solve the problems. It can create problems in many areas, because it depends how you are developing, how you are implementing tourism. And for this study, we observed the tourism development again in central Iran, very close to the first case study, in some of the regions that were close to a protected area. And government targeted many of these villages, for tourism development, because they could see the potential, and they wanted to use this, opportunity to bring, development, create jobs in the area. So we observed this tourism development in the region from 2011 to 2017 for 6 years, to see actually what is happening, how they are, developing tourism, and what is happening during this process. This is a huge study, this is a big study. But here I just want to mention one of the findings, which is related to the discussion we had earlier. It was very interesting when we were speaking to different stakeholders in this area. Department of Environment, there were people who were probably, they wanted to do everything to conserve the environment. Okay, they had all these, very strict rules, regulations, and they thought probably this is the only approach they can use, to conserve this, very fragile environment. And then we had the Department of Tourism, who was actively, encouraging tourism development in the area. And then these two departments did not have this, collaboration with each other, and they were not happy with the probably decisions that were made by by the other departments. And then we had this local community, local people here, who have not been involved in any of these decisions. For example, we had these people who wanted to conserve the environment, this government body, but they were not even, use this local knowledge, because these local people living there, they believe this environment is part of their identity. They have lived this here for many, many years. But these people, from the government, they didn't even involve these people, in conservation of the environment. or people from the Department of Tourism who had this very nicely written plan, to develop tourism, to create job in the region. They did not even involve people. They did not even inform, because that's interesting. We interviewed some of these people. They didn't even know about that such a plan even exists. They didn't know about tourism development in the region. So it was really interesting for us to see how these different stakeholders have very different goals, different ideas. They are not working together. There is no collaboration. Probably probably very similar discussion we had, looking about this idea of probably ecological justice, conservation. The other, department was thinking about, development in the region, maybe social justice, bringing money, to the region, creating, job opportunities. And then we had these community members who were part of nothing. No one was ready to, hear their voices, what they have to say, how they wanted, because they were really interested to be part of conservation. They were really interested to be part of, this tourism development, but then they had no opportunity. So again, this paper is published in Annals of Tourism Research, and I suggest you to read if you are interested to know more. A quick point I want to mention here, especially about developing countries, is many of these regions are in very early stages of tourism development. So it's very important for us, if we get everything right from the first. It can be very late if, for example, like the first case, when there is no probably trust between the stakeholders, it's very difficult to make everything right. But when you want to think about tourism development, if we can think about very, very early stages, even before exploration stage, even before tourism exists, then we can plan something sustainable. We can think about involving and using local knowledge. We can bring them to the center of development. And I have got a very good example here I want to mention. A few years ago, I was lucky to visit a national park north of India. And I am sure we have people from India, by looking at this picture, probably they know what area I'm speaking about, this Jim Corbett National Park, which is the Tiger Reserve. And just quickly saying the story, when we visited this park, we were a group of people as a tourist, as we went in for like a safari. And then we had a guy who was a local person. He was working in this tourism now, working as a local guide. And then he confessed later during our trip that he used to be a poacher in the area, but now he is working, as part of this tourism industry. When our jeep passed this narrow stream that you can see in the left photo, he asked the driver to stop. He jumped out of the car, picked something, this small fish that you can see from the stream, and showed us and asked us in the in that car out as a tourist, and asked us, what is this? We all said this is a small fish. He said, no, it's not a small fish. It is negative environmental impact, and that was the fish that was killed under the tire of this car. I was very surprised, and I was amazed to see how, when we are bringing these local people, the person even who used to be a poacher, to center of this tourism development, to give them the opportunity to run the business, they have the knowledge, to run the business. They have the knowledge to conserve the environment. Okay, so we may not need to bring people from outside to tell them what to do or what not to do. So then again, it's our decision to make, to see how we can progress with this development. So saying all this, in the last few slides I just want to discuss a few ideas briefly, and the reason is because I was honored and fortunate to start this collaboration a while ago with Dr. Freya, who is here today, and she may want to say something later about this collaboration. And I want to link it again to the discussion we had, in the last few days. We are now facing this, this pandemic as a crisis, but it's not the first crisis. It won't be the last crisis we are facing. We have something much, much bigger, biodiversity collapse, we have climate change and many other crises, and we may have something in the future. But now we have the opportunity that we didn't have before. For example, when we are thinking about climate change, if one destination wasn't desirable, we were thinking about, for example, last chance tourism and then moving to another destination. If it was like a case of over tourism, we could avoid it and then go to another destination. But now we have the opportunity because everything is paused. Okay. We have almost no tourism activity. So now we have the opportunity to bring justice to the center of tourism development, okay? To rebuild tourism, to rethink what we have done so far, okay? Maybe there was something wrong with the way we are thinking about sustainable development goals. We are missing something here. And in this work, we proposed a framework for, just recovery. And I do not believe it's only for this crisis recovery. It can be applied to any tourism development idea. We can start thinking and asking this question, recognizing the rights and value. We can think about the process involving these right holders, stakeholders, local people, indigenous people. We can think about distribution of cost and benefits, which can inform our actions later. And the other project which I'm personally very excited is the collaboration. Again, we started, to work on this, special issue in Journal of Sustainable Tourism on tourism, global crisis, and justice. And this special issue, which will come out later in 2022, is looking at, exploring this link between global crisis, not only global crisis and, sustainable tourism. We here added, justice challenges that are being faced by these, vulnerable groups and individual and society. So we will see probably, hopefully, many of these exciting papers coming out, collection of the papers who are exploring this link between, tourism, global crisis, and justice. So in my last slide, I want to finish my, talk with a comment and a quote. Let's start thinking about the futures. And I want to emphasize on the term futures and not future, because we have choices to make. We are thinking about different futures. We have the options. Let's think what's the desirable future. It might be about sustainable development goals in 10, 15, 20 years, or other goals we might have. What's that desirable future we want? What's that society we want? That peaceful, just society or tourism development, okay? Let's take steps back, okay, and see what we have to do today, to be able to achieve that in 5, 10, 15, or 20 years. We do not want to make the same mistakes. We do not want to think about, building walls in the society. We do not want to think about this marginalized or indigenous group who are being ignored for many years in different projects. So let's think about this and move towards not only more sustainable but more just tourism futures. It's all from me, and back to you, Dr. Malik.
Thank you, Dr. Raymond. That was a fantastic presentation. And I'm sure there's a lot of questions coming in the Slido. I'll also like to remind people, Slido is open. Please keep putting your questions there, and I will pick on your questions after the talk by Dr. Freya. All right, so let's go to our next speaker. We've got Dr. Freya Higgins-Desbiolles. She's from the University of South Australia. Dr. Freya is an adjunct senior lecturer in tourism management in the business unit of University of South Australia. And she's also an adjunct associate professor with the Department of Recreation and Leisure Studies in University of Waterloo. Her work focuses on social justice, human rights, and sustainability issues in tourism and affiliated sectors. She is the co-author of the book Socializing Tourism, Rethinking Tourism for Social and Ecological Justice, which is due out in August. That's next month. She has won awards for excellence in teaching, in research, in industry engagement, and media presence. So the synopsis for her talk, the UN Sustainable Development Goals agenda towards 2030 is supposed to guide tourism to a more sustainable future. However, we should be concerned about tourism dependency, tourism imposition, and power and justice in tourism. So in Dr. Freya's talk today, she will highlight the problem of ideologies and supremacy using Hawaii as an example. And she will propose localization as a strategy to combat these issues. Dr. Freya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Mayuk. I'm very pleased to be with you all. And I'm just going to get my screen ready. Sorry, I've got a little problem, so I'm just going to shift over.
While Dr. Freya is joining, showing her presentation, again, let me remind you, when you pose your question, it will be great if you can write which speaker you are addressing that question to. So it will be easier for me to post it to the relevant person. Dr. Freya.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mayuk. And I want to thank everybody who has organized the critical summer school that we're enjoying. It's such a great program. And what a creative idea of engaging us in thinking collaboratively with people from all over the world to come together and think about these really important issues in the time of the crisis of COVID. And I'm really honored to be following Dr. Raymond and his talk. I've enjoyed collaborations with him. And I think his talk has been really helpful in thinking through justice issues in tourism. So I'm going to follow on from him with some thinking that I've been doing recently and sharing with you some of these ideas. I would like to do something that we do in Australia, which is to acknowledge the Aboriginal custodians of country in recognizing that this is a settler colonial place and that the Aboriginal people never ceded sovereignty to their country. So the custodians of the place on which I'm speaking to you from are the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains. And they have cared for this country and they continue to care for this country. And I acknowledge that role that they've played, and that is a justice issue here in Australia. It's also important when we talk about justice issues in tourism for us to be transparent in our positionality. So for me, I just like to make it clear that I'm a critical scholar of tourism. And in my way of thinking about critical scholarship, what I think is that involves dealing with matters of oppression, justice, and emancipation. So as I go through my talk, you might see how that critical scholarship informs what I want to share with you at the moment. So we've heard many speakers start with this 17 sustainable development goals and giving you information about it. This presentation goes with the wheel, and the wheel may be informative in this talk of understanding that these goals are interrelated, and then they go to complexity with 169 targets sitting behind them. The UN World Tourism Organization, as the global body representing tourism interest, chose 8, 12, and 14. So dealing with work, dealing with economic growth, dealing with the marine environment, and then also dealing with sustainable production and consumption. And I think that Dr. Raymond's presentation raised the question if climate change had been a focus. In these times when we're facing one of the greatest crises of our times with climate change, we might ask, what would be our focus if we had chosen for the tourism industry and tourism stakeholders different goals to focus upon rather than just these three? Could we have chosen more, or could we have chosen different ones? So for instance, if goal 10 had been chosen about reduced inequalities, it would have brought to the forefront perhaps initiatives on social tourism. And that would be about perhaps stepping back from the market and the profit side of the tourism industry and looking at ensuring that everybody benefits from tourism. Or alternatively, we could have chosen goal 5 and looked at gender issues and inclusivity of women, women's rights and women's needs through tourism. So that's something that you might keep in mind is why were these goals chosen and what would have happened if we had chosen different ones? And I'd like to just be critical that the responsible consumption in the marine environments probably goes because of the niches that are profitable around marine tourism and around responsible tourism. And of course, growth underpins the UN World Tourism Organization's views of the industry. So a critical lens will ask us to think about the whys and what could have been if things had been different. So in doing this talk, I'd like to just bring these critical comments that were made as a source of critical insights. I think some of the people that have spoken to you previously have said the UN Sustainable Development Goals follow upon the Millennium Development Goals. And obviously the Millennium Development Goals were not sufficient to achieve the outcomes. And that's why we've moved into the 2030 agenda for the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So McCloskey said we need a critical consciousness about the failure of the MDGs, and that particularly comes to a failure to get to the root sources of the problem of poverty. So we need to understand that these goals are about dealing with poverty and how development might solve poverty issues in communities around the world. The other thing about the Sustainable Development Goals is they're inclusive of all nations rather than just being focused on the developing world. Michael Hall, who spoke to you earlier in the week as an expert lecturer, talked about the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, and he said that it's particularly pursued from a managerial approach, and it emphasizes growth and business approaches, and that obscures what are actually also in the Sustainable Development Goals agendas of social and environmental concerns. And then lastly, I just quote the gem Sir David Attenborough, who spoke before the UN Security Council recently. And he said to that important body, which is dealing with peace and security issues in the global community, that the biggest threat that we face to humanity is climate change, and to concentrate our minds on that. So these are some important articulations to say we need to keep our critical thinking active and not be idealistic about the goals. So what I'll propose to you is I'd like to draw upon my research on peace through tourism, and particularly there's a longstanding peace analyst named Stuart Rees who talked about understanding peace within the context of justice, which he defined as not only the absence of conflict, but also the presence of fairness, justice, and equity in society. And economy and politics. So really what this asks us to do is to go to the wider structural context of where tourism occurs and to ask, are we achieving progress toward fairness, justice, and equity rather than just reducing conflict? And particularly with the peace and justice in Sustainable Development Goal 16, it emphasizes the idea of governance, but governance isn't getting to these underlying structures of fairness, justice, and equity. That's a more deep level. So with tourism, we might interrogate it. And I like that word that comes from critical tourism studies: interrogate, question, challenge. What is tourism's role in conflict, in poverty, in exploitation, and all forms of supremacy? And I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment. And I'm going to offer a provocation that I think where we stand in the situation between the global north and the global south, and the failure to alleviate poverty and the failure to address development, is because we failed to decolonize, and that there's ongoing injustices between these relationships. And I think that imperialistic forces are still operative. And I'll try to explain that in the brief time that I have. So the framing that I want to offer is to put tourism in the context of an unjust international system and go through some history, which suggests it could have been otherwise, that we missed a moment in the 1970s. And I think that because our communities, our knowledge systems are becoming ahistorical, that we've forgotten this moment in history that was missed. There was a movement for decolonization in the 1960s and 70s, and developing countries called for a transition to a new international economic order, the NIEO. The NIEO was meant to push decolonization, independency on imperial powers, and bring about a new economic system that would be based upon interdependency and fair economies. There was resistance in the Third World or the Global South through the group of 77 nations to resist Western dominance. And this was subject to the time of the Cold War. I note that we had international agreements which were supposed to be a body of rights that ensured that humans could thrive. But the convention that got more grip in the international system was the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, rather than the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So the first was implemented and the latter has been left to states to address. But these are rights that people have to food, housing, proper living conditions, dignity, and decent life. And those are not enforceable, whereas the Covenant for Civil and Political Rights has been more willing to be enforced. And then another pillar of this was the idea that the global North owed the global South because of imperialism and the taking of resources, pillaging of developing countries through imperial colonization, that the North owed the South aid, technology, and a fair trading system, and that there would be a target of 0.7% of gross national income owed by countries to support global South countries to reach a fair economy, a global economy. That was a UN target from 1970. Very few countries ever reached it. And I note that the UK legislated it in 2017. It is rare that countries did implement it. Some of the Scandinavian countries did. So what I then want to just do is to move to tourism, to say that we had this possibility that then has been overshadowed. But this situation in the global community in the 1970s actually was mirrored in tourism. So for instance, Donna Chambers worked with, I think, David Airy in this work about Jamaica and talking about the tourism policy. And Jamaica at decolonization, 1972 to 1980, had a socialist era. And it was the Jamaicanization of the tourism industry that was about a domestic sector, empowerment of workers, indigenous values, and ensuring that the Jamaican society benefited from a form of tourism that enhanced their dignity and their values as a people. There's also a great piece of work on Ghana about the same time under President Rowley, written by Ingman, that also analyzes the situation in Ghana, talking about decolonization and the connection to African diasporic communities as a source of pride. So you can see this history that sat there, and then you can ask what we've transitioned to in this moment and what we might have missed as a result of that. I think this history matters. Instead, what we got from then this moment of justice that could have come from decolonization, instead we got neoliberal globalization, which particularly came because the Cold War collapsed and we didn't have that rivalry. We got structural adjustment programs on developing countries enforced by the World Bank and the IMF. The terms of trade were imposed by the World Trade Organization. So for instance, in tourism, we had the General Agreement on Trades and Services, which has created unfair conditions of trade for developing countries in the tourism sector and have pushed countries to reduce their social and environmental protections. So this is a really important context to understand. And in terms of tourism, what happened is tourism was promoted as a path to development by the United Nations and the World Tourism Organization and other bodies. And as a result, we've gotten real vulnerabilities for developing countries over tourism dependency because their subsistence sectors have been reduced and they've been told tourism is an easy path to development. Now, if you want to do some reading about this to understand what I'm talking about, because I've done a very quick run through some complicated history. The work by Moforth and Munt on tourism sustainability in 2016 is a great support for this discussion. So have a look at that. So some of the markers of tourism injustices that arise from this situation is we get privatization of land, privatization of the right to land. So for instance, with the tsunami in the Indian Ocean, the beaches were privatized in the aftermath of that crisis, of that disaster. You have the taking of the commons and dispossession of people. That is already happening here in Australia, for instance, that our national parks are being allowed to have private eco-lodges developed against the will of the community. Tourism dependency, I've already mentioned, and the loss of subsistence. We see this in places like Kenya, where they're growing flowers for the markets of Europe, and places like Bali that are very exposed to a tourism dependency. We get tourism imposition on places and loss of self-determination. I'd suggest that's what we see in Barcelona when cheap package tours bring over tourism to Barcelona. You get the dominance of big multinationals, which I'm really worried is only going to get worse after COVID. So for instance, the dominance of TUI out of Europe is going to be huge in the global community. And with that, you get the difficulties for the informal sectors in the global South to thrive. You get exploitative work conditions in tourism and hospitality. So we find poor pay, poor working conditions, seasonality, precarity. And even here in Australia, we've got wage theft, widespread wage theft in these sectors. There's mobility inequalities. So we find refugees can't find safe haven when they need it, but tourists have free access. We have a business failure to pay taxes by the big end of town in corporations. In the cruise sector, they use flags of convenience to avoid paying the taxes that they owe and to reduce their taxes through those mechanisms. And then finally, we get these ecological damages and violence. And I think that the work of, excuse me, Rob Fletcher and Bram Butcher is really good about this, about the creation of national parks in parts of Africa like Tanzania and Kenya, taking away the land from indigenous peoples, and in fact, militarizing the place and the safety of the conservation. So those are some examples. And then what I want to introduce to you is this idea of supremacy, that I think one of the problems that we see sitting behind these injustices is ideas of supremacy. And I think Raymond alluded to some of these things happening. And I call this a circle of domination. So we've got racism and white supremacy, which is what drove the imperial colonial conquest of the European powers in the developing world. We've got patriarchy of men's dominance of women. We've got anthropocentrism of domination of nature and animals. We have ideas of religious supremacy, that some religions are better than others and justify violence and injustices. And then, of course, I've been talking about imperialism and colonization. If we take the thinking of Kimberly Crenshaw, who talked about intersectionality of oppressions, these things are interlinked together and reinforcing. So it's important to understand that. And then my question is tourism a form of supremacy? Does tourism ideology assert this oppression as well? So the fact that the tourist interest and tourism industry interest override local communities is a real concern of mine. So I'll propose that that might be a form of supremacy as well. So then I just want to bring Hawaii as an example into this and to show the problems that can exist and how Hawaii has become a place for tourism that has erased the local people and their local sovereignty. I don't think many people are aware that Hawaii is an occupied land. The local monarchy that the Kanakamali, which are the native Hawaiian people, had, was illegally overthrown, and it was overthrown by American planters. And the Hawaiians have never ceded sovereignty to their land. So this is still an ongoing place that needs decolonization and removal from imperialism. And the results of this situation, you've had the illegal occupation, then leading to it becoming a military base, a major place for US military, then an imposed form of tourism that's very offensive to culture and that takes up Hawaiian sacred practices and beliefs and commercializes and commodifies it. And then lastly, this removal of the native people because they can't afford the land anymore. So a real oppression of the peoples in this situation. So this slide mentions some of the things that come out of this. Haunani Kane Trask, who recently passed away, has opposed this and drawn attention to what happened to Hawaii for a number of years. And she says tourists flock to this native place as a land for escape, and they don't understand that they're participating in the destruction of a people. And she said in another quote, "We ask you not to come." The churches in Hawaii promulgated the 1989 Hawaii Declaration on Tourism, which said tourism is not an indigenous practice, and they see tourism as an exploitation, and that tourism actually damages sacred sites, the beaches, it threatens the culture, and it's very bad. And then more recently, the native Hawaiian, the Kanaka Maoli people have been opposing what's being done to animals. So there was a real controversy that some mainland American Instagrammers took a picture of petting a monk seal resting on the beach, which really angered the Hawaiian people because monk seals are endangered and they're very important to Hawaiian beliefs of protection that they have. And the dolphins as well. This thing from the Facebook page of Protect Mauna Kea talks about the dolphins being harassed by the tourists. So again, is that blue economy? Are we seeing that fit under the Sustainable Development Goals, this dolphin tourism that exploits the dolphins? There are reactions to this, though, and one exciting thing that's happened is something called detours, and this stands for decolonial tourism. And many actors in Hawaii are trying to decolonize tourism and assert native authority over the place. So it is a challenge to the neo-colonial authority. Detours mark the envisioning of another Hawaii and bringing that to life before the people on the tour's eyes. The decolonial effort of detours is to restore the Ea of Hawaii. Ea refers to both political independence, but is also translated as the meaning of life and breath, so it's essential. So what this is evoking is experience of Hawaii is about the land, the relationships formed through the process of remembering, and that these are storied places, and that we need to understand the stories that pertain to this place. So this brings us to the idea that detours offer an alternative travel guide, and that we need to understand that there are protocols for visiting a place and that we should request permission before entering. If we do this, this changes tourism. This gives local communities the rights to be real custodians of place. The permission to enter a well-loved place is conditional, though. It demands that we have encounters and that the deference to the authority of the local knowledge is essential. And also to understand that you may not be granted to a place, that the opportunity to enter a particular location may be reserved for only some. And so that tells tourists that you can't have everything that you want. It changes the power equation. So that brings me to my recent work, which is looking at redefining tourism by the local community. This is a process of local communities inviting, receiving, and hosting guests in their local community for limited time durations, with the intention that they receive benefits from such actions. Now, this shifts the power equation so that it's not the tourist and the tourism industry that are demanding things and making local communities into host communities. It is centered upon the local community's rights being the basis of all interactions. And then it changes the relationships with all stakeholders as a result of that. And so this model shows you this. So tourists need to be guests. Tourism businesses need to understand that they must have a social license to operate. And industry associations are not marketing bodies, that there are bodies to serve the community's interest and the public good. So by this model, if it can be done, we could transform tourism to a more just basis, in my view. And then continuing on with that, what we mean by local community in this work, we're working at defining this, that local community is the local people, but it's the local ecology as well, and it's all the generations. So that gets back to what Dr. Raymond was saying to you about a more than human approach, that we are humans in relationship with our place. And we're not only the humans of today, we're the humans of the past, and we're the humans of the future. Now, I'm running out of time, so I will get very close to finishing now. Defining the tourism by the local community must enact the following: ensure that local communities benefit from tourism in their localities, allow communities key roles in decision-making, but ultimately the big one is allow the community to say no. We know that communities are empowered if they can say no to tourism. And we're finding this in places like Barcelona, in Venice recently is saying no to the big cruise ships. And then could we localize tourism like the Jamaicanization program that I referred to earlier that was done between 1972 and 1980, as Professor Chambers talked about, where the tourism benefits the workers and the local communities. And you think about local community benefiting as tourists. So how far does this go in addressing the issues of tourism? This is what I'm challenging you to think about. So does this solve things? Is it possible that we could address things like global development issues and climate change by such approach? What lens do we use to look at the Sustainable Development Goals? Are we looking at no poverty and zero hunger in our efforts? Which goals are prioritized? These are all critical questions I'd like you to think about as you walk away from this summer school, and to do some deep thinking about that. So what about COVID-19? Are things going to be different? Well, in Bali, it was reported in a great article in the New York Times, if I remember correctly, that the villages in the north were finding that the workers from the south, where a lot of the tourism development is, were going back to their family villages and going back to the land as a result of COVID-19. And one local leader was quoted as saying, people are depending on tourism like it's opium. Tourism is fragile and we've gone too far. We've abandoned the fundamental things that mobilize the economy. So this idea of dependency, I think, is a big justice issue. And in fact, a report on the situation with COVID not very long ago, released by the UN Committee on Development and the UN World Tourism Organization, actually flagged that tourism dependency may be a problem. So my whole talk is to get us to think about that, about how do we put tourism in its proper place, in its structural context, and how do we make it serve communities? Then I think we're getting to an agenda where justice might be served. So I've given in my PowerPoint, which will be in the recording if you want to follow through, some links for some case studies that could help you explore these ideas. There are no easy answers and it's very complicated. And then lastly, my references. So thank you very much for listening to me. I'm really privileged to be such a part of this great event, and I'm very happy to be with you. Thank you.
Fantastic speech, Dr. Freya. Again, there's a lot of questions you finished with, and that's something which I believe in, that whenever there is any kind of discussions, we should not leave with answers. We should leave with questions, and that makes us think. So while I was writing down lots of things, lots of points which you made and Dr. Raymond made, I'll summarize that later. But before that, can I ask the facilitator to switch on the Zoom poll so that our respondents can start answering some questions. And while you're doing the Zoom poll, I would also start with the question answer session because we are running maybe 10 minutes over time. So I will post the first question to Dr. Raymond. How can we make blue-green certification more beneficial for developing countries? Dr. Raymond.
Yeah, I think that's a very good question, but probably very difficult to answer. When we are thinking about this blue economy, if it does as it promises, if it brings the local people to the center of development, if when they are thinking about for example this developing even tourism in these areas, if it's like people are involved in decision making, if they have their voice is heard, and then they are actually the people who are benefiting from the program, then it might be something that we can consider as sustainable. But if we are like the other cases that we see happening, in many other places, that they are just, trying to implement the plan with the help. I said they probably have a very good intention, okay? And they, like the example we saw, they want to bring economic development to the region. But if we are not involving these people, if we do not consider how it's going to affect, local community, then that's not going to be a sustainable, development. But again, it's different regions might have different, agendas. They have different policies, and it's not maybe really probably easy, question to answer.
True. Very, very true.
But because I know Freya mentioned something, she may want to add, something here. Okay.
Maybe I'll pose another question to Dr. Freya. How do you change the mindsets of those in power? I'm focusing towards the government in order to achieve social justice in tourism.
That is such a great question. Well, we look at what's going on with Myanmar. We had a report on our Australian television last night, which just broke my heart. And I know Myanmar was one of the leaders in responsible tourism. And I think anybody that would have been involved with that country would be heartbroken at the situation that they're in. How do any of us change power with the political and the military institutions that we have? And we're all facing the same oppressions, which is why this idea of supremacy came to me. I was watching Black Lives Matter in the US, and you can tell I'm American by my American accent, now an Australian, and wondering how relevant is this for the rest of the world? And I think it is very relevant that the supremacy that we're seeing asserted in all the forms that I mentioned in my circle of domination, they're related in the global community. So what do? We have to hold them to account. I think Michael Hall said in one of his books that I used in my teaching about speaking truth to power, but speaking truth to power comes with consequences. And we have to be brave enough to be willing to wear those consequences. And we have to use the political systems that we have. And we have to make our choices. I'm particularly concerned about future generations. I don't have children, but I fight really hard for everybody's children because we owe it to them to change the future that we're heading to. And the reason that I chose David Attenborough and his statement about climate change, that I really think that we're in dire straits about climate change and we have to do everything we can. So how do you do it? Get in power. All of you, please pay attention to your government. Get involved in local levels of governance if you can. Get elected, get involved. Play a part in civil society institutions and advocate. And get involved, because it's us that's going to change the future. That's what I found really great about Raymond's talk at the end, was that inspirational statement that he gave us at the end that was very helpful. We all have to do our part and do what we can.
Certainly. Carrying on to the same question and on the topic of climate change, I'll pose this question to Prof. Raymond. Social injustice is happening in small island nations. And the nations need to choose between economic development versus environmental degradation, like coral bleaching and global warming, plastic on the beaches, etc. So, what's your view on this?
That's again wonderful question, because we have heard a lot about this climate change and how it's affecting those destinations. A while ago, I was watching, I have never had a chance to visit, one of those destinations, but I was watching one of, these videos and see how they are affected. I feel really bad for these communities. But the thing is, this destination, they may not have enough resources, but even when we are thinking about, places like Australia, okay, Great Barrier Reef, Australia is a very country who has resources, who have probably this knowledge, maybe scientists, okay? But they are still dealing with the same problem. They are still dealing with this crowd reaching, probably unsustainable, some unsustainable, tourism activities. So they are training because it's in the reality is, tourism in this region is, creating job. It's bringing, money to the community. It's very good source of income for the region and for the whole state. And even we can think about the country. But at the same time, they have to think about, conservation of the environment. And it's like I think I can refer to the conversation that was yesterday in Regina's, and Joseph's, discussion. Finding this sweet spot, it's not very, easy to do that, and that's why I said when you are thinking about different regions, different, countries or communities, they might have different, agendas. Okay, and to me, because I saw many of these communities, they have probably the best knowledge. They have the, they are the people who have to decide about the futures. Okay, so it's up to them what directions they want to take. However, I understand they might not be responsible for what's happening to them. Okay, there might be other countries, other nations who are producing all this pollution, and then it's going to affect these small island nations. So we all understand them, and it's very difficult, decision to make.
True. And I agree, like what you said, it's not just the environment, it's not just the people in smaller islands. Somebody was, a couple of days ago, we were talking about females and female empowerment and how the gender ratios, the gender salaries, lots of issues there between the male and female bit. But there's something which I'm researching on a little bit nowadays, but there's no focus on LGBTQA plus people when it comes to UN SDG. And this is a very big part of especially the hospitality and tourism industry, especially in Southeast Asia. Let's say, for example, Thailand, a big chunk of hospitality people come from this community. And maybe we need to think about them as well.
Yeah,
and
exactly.
we have to think about each and everybody on this planet. If we are thinking of people in marginalized communities, if we are thinking of people in war-torn zones, we are thinking of animals, we definitely need to think about a big chunk, a major category of people. What I would do now is, it's 4:20 now, I'll quickly summarize, and after I summarize your talks, we will see the poll results. There's so much happening in this talk. I'm really excited, and I think not just me, all 425 people here are really excited regarding this talk, and I think 1.5 hours is not enough, personally. I think we could have a one-day session with Dr. Freya and then one day full with Dr. Raymond. And maybe we can start scratching the surface of all these things. And I'll list them down. So Dr. Raymond, you touched on all the goals, like ensuring access to affordable and reliable, sustainable and modern energy, climate change impacts, sustainable oceans and marine life, sustainable ecosystems on terrestrial ecosystems like forest and biodiversity. You also talked about something which is really interesting for me, which is morality and multi-species justice. Because the concept of morality, again, like both of you discussed, is different for different people. Morality could stem from your social upbringing. It could also stem majorly from your religious or non-religious values. So morality and multi-species justice towards, animals and like dolphins, and, we definitely need some kind of lots of in-depth qualitative research on teasing out data of what people feel, what people understand, what are their feelings towards these issues. So that's we need to rethink tourism, like Dr. Raymond said. Dr. Freya, also, you talked about climate change, and I completely concur on what David Attenborough says towards what's happening in the world, not just towards tourism, but also towards food habits. Again, I come from the F&B side. So again, food habits and tourist food habits are something which is really, really important, because we carry our culture and we present it through our food. Our food habits are very, very important here. Dr. Freya also talked about, Prof. Freya, about failure to decolonize being one of the major issues. Again, something which could take, it's not something we can discuss in 5 minutes. It's something very, very deep, and talking about imperial countries pillaging, what do you say, the global South countries. I don't know whether it's the right word to use nowadays, but third world countries. Again, there's lots of talks about reparations coming from, stemming from this. I'm sure you may have seen lots of talks happening regarding this. You talked about tourism dependency, tourism imposition, and poor work conditions. Again, this again close to my heart, coming from the hospitality industry. And all these things stem from religious supremacy, racism, and patriarchy. The table which you showed was really interesting, and again could be just one session only on that table, just trying and understanding that table. You also talked about decolonization in Hawaii. I had no idea about this, and this is something which I would really love to read and get to know. I'm sure same with the other participants here as well. And you finished with, again, from Dr. Raymond, the words which I highlighted was morality and multi-species justice. And from your talk, I highlighted the last words which you said, which was local communities need to become custodians. And if people do that, or if the governments allow communities to do that, that will alleviate the suffering which is being faced, in my opinion, again, by communities worldwide. So fantastic session, really, really interesting. I think we need to see the poll result and see the answers from everybody. Okay, so the first question was the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal 16 on peace and justice is one of the goals of World Tourism Organization, selected for focus in supporting of UN agenda. So yeah, 95% people agree to it, which is interesting. 6% don't agree to it. All right. Sir David Attenborough says, designated, this is the biggest threat to modern humans have ever faced. Climate change. Again, correct. Many people say COVID-19. Sir David Attenborough, again, is more towards animals and environment. Going ahead. Defining tourism by local community would enact which of the following? All of the above. Okay. And the idea of multi-species justice promotes development programs bringing benefits to community and local environment. Again, this number 4 is very split. I would call it a split decision. So I think we need to talk about this a little bit before we finish. Number 5, how vulnerable groups and ecosystems, their needs and rights are identified at local level, is about recognition principles of justice. Okay. A sustainable and just tourism recovery requires all of the above. Okay, fantastic. I'll just go back a little bit to the multi-species justice and maybe have a little input coming from Prof. Freya.
Yeah, I won't say that's a wrong answer, just to pick the the third one, because it can definitely bring benefits to the community and local environment. But the reason we discuss this idea, as you mentioned, is about the morality, and think about this idea of thinking about human, non-human, and natural environment. So I would probably pick the first one as a definition, as the way. It's not my definition, it's defined by someone else, and there are papers. If you are on, other people are interested, you can go and read. But definitely, if we follow this path, it can bring benefits to both community and the environment.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you to both speakers. I mean, it was an excellent presentation. Just to let everybody know, we will get the Slido on screen right now. Facilitators, could you just show us the Slido so that everybody can give one-word answers to what they feel about this presentation. And while you're doing this, let me also remind you that the next session, which is on tourism and peace, follows the same sustainable development goal. So please, if you are here, please do join us again at 5 o'clock Malaysia time, half an hour from now, so that they also, you learn. I mean, it's an extension to what we started right now. Okay, Ms. Sumita, our facilitator, thank you so much. Can we do the photograph, digital photograph?
Okay, Dr. Mayuk. Okay, can I have everyone have your good hospitality smile? Bring page 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Next page. Next. 7th page. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Sumita. Can I request Dr. Kandapan to show us the results of the Slido?
Thank you, Dr. Mayuk, for managing the moderating the session very well, session 10. And also on behalf of CRiT, we would like to again thank the speaker, Dr. Freya and Dr. Raymond, for making this wonderful afternoon in Malaysia very fruitful, very informative. I think you can see the inputs from the participants keep coming in. Participants, those who have missed to scan the QR code, you can still see on the left top. Please post your one-word feedback to our speakers. Okay, I think justice is coming in. Sustainability always there. So the bigger bubbles indicates that our outcome of this session is in aligned, and we have found the right speaker for the theme.
Definitely, definitely.
Yeah. So we should. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. I think there are almost 400 plus participants. Please take your maybe 5 seconds to post one word. It won't take more than that. I don't know whether requesting is a justice or not, but still we request you. Okay, so yeah, when you are posting, probably we go to the last slide. Yes, I think Dr. Mayuk already mentioned, but still I take a role to inform you all again. Thank you once again, all the participants. I think being on Friday afternoon, it's not easy to get the support from participants across globally with different time zones. I think we are almost, I can say, with our registration around close to 50 countries. I think 50 to 60% of countries' participation is here. So we sincerely would like to thank everybody, and please stay tuned. I think we will start our next session in 25 minutes. So now it's a time for you to take a quick health break, or probably fill your coffee cup, or probably for someone maybe a breakfast or lunch, because people are joining us from different part of the world. So stay tuned. And once again, we would like to thank Dr. Freya and Dr. Raymond for making this session a wonderful one and meaningful and informative. Thank you, Dr. Mayuk and Dr. Smita, for making our session more good. Thank you, Ms. Smita, for monitoring the Slido and also compiling the question, right question, so that I think the participants are also satisfied with the outcome of the question. And also the students helper and also organizing committee. Thank you. Stay tuned. We will probably open the floor with information, which is going to be the last session. This is the last session. I think we should everybody keep the same spirit. Almost this is the 11th session, starting in another 20 minutes, which is tourism and peace. The reason why we put the tourism and peace as a last, we want to end everything very peaceful. Okay, so we want a peace in the whole country. So that's the reason why we kept the tourism and peace. So stay tuned. Peace, collaboration, networking, knowledge sharing, still not over. So join us in 20 minutes. The session tourism and peace. We have 3 speakers, Dr. Henna, Dr. Fabio and Dr. Omar, joining from different countries, moderated by Dr. Ellis and Ms. Kyria from Taylor's University, School of Hospitality, Tourism and Events and School of Food Studies and Gastronomy. Thank you so much, everyone. Let me also go and fill my coffee cup.
Thank you, Mr. Kandavan. Thank you, Ms. Freya. Thank you, Raymond. Have
Thank
a nice
you,
evening.
Dr. Freya. Thank you, Dr. Raymond.
Thank you
Is
very
it
much, Dr. Freya, Dr. Raymond, for great.
Everyone.
It's dinner time.